So I'd like to say welcome everyone this evening to a display from Paul Pitcher. Just to give you a bit of background, Paul and I have spoken before about this and what he wants to cover tonight. So Paul is a retired veterinary epidemiologist from Pennsylvania who specialised in nutrition and infectious diseases of dairy, swine and poultry. Um, and Paul received his first stamp album in 1966 as a Christmas present from his Danish grandparents. And in the last years has been more interested in the production methods of early engraved stamps, so specialising in the Danish West Indies bicolours. His latest project has been to explore production methods and usage of the Seated Britannia stamp produced by Perkins Bacon and Co, aiming to develop schemes to sort these into their various printings or consignments. So, with that said, I'll hand over to you, Paul, and we're all looking forward to hearing what you can tell us about Perkins Bacon's Britannia stamps.
Oh boy. Um, I just got a message. My internet connection is unstable. Am I coming through okay?
You're coming
Okay, very
through.
good. I'll carry on. Give me a high sign if something's not working. Um, so here we go. My objectives today are to discuss a little bit of the plate production techniques that were used in the production of the Seated Britannias by Perkins Bacon and Company. We're going to look again at stamp production techniques and challenges, how consignments were signaled, the invoicing of the product of the
Um,
stamp usage practices and challenges, uh, how orders were placed, when they were placed, canceling devices. And I'm working off of a general objective to arrange the stamps in the order in which they appeared. And that's a quote from
Yeah.
Bacon and Napier, which we'll get to directly. So you've probably seen these items before. Just some, context: the island of Barbados, about 21 miles long and 14 miles wide at its widest point, with 11 post offices roughly located by the red numerals. Um, Trinidad will also discuss Trinidad. Here's a couple of interesting postcards from uh, early part of the 20th century. Note at the bottom right there the caption in French. And at the time, Trinidad was taken over by the British as a colony in 1797, I believe. There were about 1,500 French planters still living on the island. So, hence the French caption on the postcard. Here's the island of Trinidad with the 21 post offices shown. I know that there's more than that now. This is actually a map from, I believe, 1916 or thereabouts. And what I like about it is it shows the routes of the coastal schooners around the island. And as many of these post offices, particularly the remote ones, were located on the coast, we can presume, I think, that mail was carried from these post offices via coastal schooner. The main post office being in Port of Spain, there, number one. I think my pointer is quite visible. Um, Other thing I'll point out is that steamers arriving from England would have gone around the southern aspect of the island, through the Serpent's Mouth, and up to Port of Spain from the south. Also note the continent of South America was only 6 miles away from the island of Trinidad, or is. Trinidad is much larger than Barbados, about 60 miles from north to south. Um, and we could talk about economic development, but I'm going to move on. Um, I like this postcard a lot because it is a very high resolution image, probably printed on a glass plate negative around about 1895. The camera is looking due east off the east coast of Barbados. And this is the first uh, steam powered sugar refinery in Barbados. It was converted to steam probably not much before 1895, but it's obviously a remnant of the age before steam, when perhaps the chaff from the cane was burned to boil down the cane syrup. Um, Very interesting. Barbados was heavily dependent on beasts of burden. We see a hitch of, I believe, those are probably oxen, and then some mules, a hitch of 4 mules up here, a couple other cattle over in here, a load of cane, 2 loads of cane waiting to be unloaded, probably the drying shed in the back here, and the steam plant over here with a small line running across to the main plant. So quite an interesting image in my mind, and I think it says a lot about the evolution of sugar production in the islands, which was, of course, the main source of the main economic activity. Jacob Perkins is who we have to acknowledge for the Seated Britannias. He began his apprenticeship as a young boy, about 12 years old, and learned engraving and probably a lot about metallurgy in the process, publishing some early works on the use of steel to produce plates for printing. Of course, Perkins Bacon was responsible for the notable Pacific Steam Navigation Company private packet stamps, where we see this geometric lathe work for engraving surfaces applied as anti-counterfeiting measure. And it was quite widely accepted and very successful. We see it persisting on both continents. He developed that system with a guy named Spencer, and along with Fairman, Perkins moved to England in 1819. You may know there was actually a contest to for engravers to show off their craft in producing. England was having a terrible time with banknote counterfeiting in the first part of the 19th century, and actually had a contest to discover ways to prevent counterfeiting. As it turns out, Perkins did not win a commission based on his entry in this contest, but certainly was notable for what he produced, which I've got some samples to show here. Later on, he partnered with his son-in-law, Joshua Bacon, hence the name Perkins Bacon and Company. I mentioned Henry Petch as an engraver who died really before the Seated Britannias were produced, but was certainly influential. Here are some samples of his early work. Of course, Perkins and Bacon produced the first postage stamp, the infamous penny black, and you can see examples of the geometric lathe work along the sides of this stamp. Some other examples, these are U.S. stamps from the 1860 to 61 issue, again, showing the lathe work that was, again, a mechanism to prevent counterfeiting. Some cliches from banknotes, rather ornate. This process worked much like a spirograph toy to produce the engravings, and it was very, very difficult to counterfeit in the absence of that machine. Counterfeiters could not match the precision that the lathe engraving provided. Here's the reverse of a 25-cent banknote, Perkins really became notable in the colonies in America very early on as a producer of banknotes. And so his legacy obviously persisted into the early postage stamps of the United States, even though he had been living in England for decades by then. So the process, it's what's called a recess intaglio process. I don't know how much y'all know about this process. I find it useful to kind of understand, some of the limitations in the production of stamps by this method to understand just how it was done. So they started with a piece of soft annealed steel, and annealing is the process by which carbon is driven out of the metal to make it very soft and suitable for carving or lathe work. So they would anneal a piece of steel to serve as a blank, engrave it in reverse, and then harden that die, again with a heat treatment process. Then an annealed transfer roller at the bottom here could be passed across that hardened steel die for the impression to be transferred to the roller. The roller was then hardened, and then it was applied to an annealed plate to transfer the impression from the roller to the plate. And finally, before printing stamps, the plate was hardened. So one of the interesting aspects, I'm trying to think as we get into the second design of the Seated Britannia that had the value label at the bottom, how did Perkins and Bacon do that without having to start the process of engraving the die from scratch? Well, I believe what they did was to create an intermediate die that had the label field at the bottom edge of the stamp blank. And then that was hardened and transferred to a roller, let's say, so that they could produce additional intermediate dies to in turn engrave with the appropriate value, if that makes sense. If you have questions, keep them in mind, and we'll review that at the end. It's a little bit confusing, but if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. So here's a picture at the top left there of the transferring press. You can see the transfer roller mounted on the top, and then the blank plate would be mounted on a bed that rolled back and forth from left to right. So as that plate was rolled, and then the roller die would be pressed down into the plate, and the plate would be rolled back and forth to transfer the image from the roller to the plate. Probably the most interesting feature of this process in my mind is that every single impression on the plate was identical. So it kind of implies that the concept of plating this particular stamp is somewhat meaningless because, in theory at least, every single stamp was the same, produced off. And be that as it may, there was only one plate produced for the first design of the Seated Britannia. We'll get to that in more detail. In the bottom right here, we have a printing room. It looks to me like there are 3 printing presses lined up there in a row. Where's my pointer? 1, 2, 3. And I think I see 1, 2, 3, 4 heads in the room. So a crowded space. I find it very interesting or very useful to think about just how the process was executed. It looks like there's another press here at the far left of that image. So 4 presses in the room, 4 people working. It was the one guy here looks like he is, where's my pointer again? There it is. This fellow here looks like he is wiping a plate with a rag, and kind of, again, back to the process, the plates were first inked. The plate was first inked, and then it was wiped with a rag to remove the excess ink. And the process dictated that this fellow also burnished the inked plate with his hand to complete the inking process. And so I can only imagine the size of the heap of ink-soaked rags that would have been left at the end of the day. There are, we have very good records, and I'll get to that again in more detail. The records show that they could print up to maybe 2,000 sheets a day from a single plate. And so I find it hard to believe that a single person could do that. So I'm guessing that there was probably 3 fellows working that press. One guy to sling paper, one guy to sling ink, and the other guy to manage the whole mess. But certainly a labor-intensive process, and with lots of places, opportunities for it to go wrong, so to speak. So here are the final design proofs for the Barbados Seated Britannia. The first design in the upper left there, 43 consignments were printed, amounting to just under 54,000 sheets, again, from a single plate. So it attests very highly to the robustness of that plate, to the process itself. We get into the second design, and again, here's that value label at the bottom edge of the stamp. And in order to avoid, well, there would have been a separate die, you can see the 6pence, the Barbados label is in a serif font, and on the 1 shilling, the Barbados label is sans serif. So they would have had a separate die for each one of these 2 stamps. On that second design, there were 9,000, almost 10,000 sheets printed, over 15 consignments. We also have several other values. There was 1 printing each done by Perkins and Bacon of the halfpenny, the 1 penny, and the 3 pence in 1873. Perkins and Bacon also produced a plate for the 4 pence, but they never printed any stamps from it before the plates went to De La Rue and Company in 1874. So Perkins and Bacon apparently lost the contract to produce these stamps to De La Rue and Company. And we can speculate as to why that happened. I think I have several points of evidence towards one particular explanation, and I'll just blurt it out right here. We can discuss it further as we go, but it's my judgment, let's say, that Perkins Bacon and Company did not do a good job of accounting for all of the sheets of stamps they produced. Of course, there would have been printer's waste, ink that was smudged. There would have been sheets that were damaged in the perforation process. What happened to all these stamps? Perkins and Bacon did not account for those. And I'm presuming that Inland Revenue was sensitive to that issue. After all, these stamps are no different than paper money. And if the paper money is not properly accounted for, all kinds of funny things can happen, which we will come back to. Here are the Trinidad final proofs. Bottom line, I think here is that there were roughly 6 times more stamps printed for Barbados than there were for Trinidad. So hence, for our investigation here, we get a lot more utility out of the stamps of Barbados. So I will talk about the stamps of Trinidad, but most of the important things I have to say are about the stamps of Barbados. Perkins and Bacon did not print any stamps for Trinidad after 1861. So moving on. I want to point out a foible maybe of the process by which plates were produced. This would be a particular plate, a bit block here would be considered 3 rows of 3, 3 rows of 3. And so the roller that impressed the plate, the hardened roller would have moved vertically up this plate to make the subsequent impressions. So you would have had, so all of the sheets of stamps that were printed for, that we're going to talk about today, were sheets of 110, 11 rows of 10. And we'll have some full sheets to look at here in a minute. But the point I want to make here is the enlargements here of the intersections, if you will, show just how poorly aligned the individual impressions were relative to each other on the roller and relative to each pass, to subsequent passes. So if you work from left to right here, the second pass was started in a different place than the first pass, and the third pass was started in a different place than the second pass. So not only that, but they're misaligned in the other axis. So this would make perforation very complicated, and that was something that Perkins and Bacon did not foresee when these plates were produced. Really required much greater accuracy in aligning that roller when you emboss the plate. You can also see subtle differences in the stars and the corners, indicating that they were hand engraved. And yet, if you look at the same star, so this would be the upper right star, it looks very similar in subsequent passes. So this star is very similar to that star. This star is very similar to that star. Again, suggesting, multiple impressions from that roller that were essentially identical. I may be belaboring that point. So in this investigation, mint stamps are not helpful. Here are a couple of mint strips which I happen to acquire, not by intent, but just when I purchased the material for this investigation, I purchased the largest lots I could find, and with many stamps in them to sort through, and sometimes you end up with some oddball stuff. This one is the upper strip is a bizarre color and obviously over inked. It doesn't show so well in the reproduction here, but the letters of Barbados are not as clear as they should be. Same on the bottom. Obviously, that sheet was over inked, and so it probably ended up as printer scrap. Well, how did it end up in the marketplace then as a mint stamp later on? Well, first of all, we had the London Philatelic Exhibition. This actually applies to Mauritius. And Mauritius, as you probably know, is notorious for a lot of mint stamps which are not representative of the stamps that were actually used. And this explanation here is kind of explains why. First of all, how did Perkins Bacon have 27, well, yeah, it would have been 25 sheets, let's say, of unissued Mauritius stamps remainder. I mean, that's a lot of remainders, I guess, in my opinion. And then Bacon and Napier later on in their handbook series described something called the Great Find, which occurred sometime in 1891, I believe, where a huge cache of mint stamps was discovered and brought to the market. So again, more evidence that Perkins Bacon was not as rigorous as they should have been in accounting for remainders to inland revenue. And again, I believe that was their downfall eventually, ultimately. Okay, so again, I've been mentioning Bacon and Napier. They produced a series of 6 or 7 handbooks under commission by Stanley Gibbons. And these are a couple of quotes from Grenada, which has a very nice description of the perforation process, which I relied upon for this investigation. So separating the stamps into the different form of perforations, If you count imperforate stamps, we have 7 different perforations over the span of some 14 years. So really, that's very helpful. And I'm throwing in cancellations here in brackets because cancellations are also very useful to separate the stamps into their various printings. And there's that objective again, arrange the stamps in the order in which they appeared. What is a consignment? And I'm defining it, and I got this term from Sir John Marriott's book on Trinidad. He uses consignments as a way to segregate the various printings. And so I'm defining consignment as the collection of actions pursuant to a written order for stamps by the Crown agent in the colony. So a request was sent to Perkins Bacon. That took probably 3 weeks to deliver by steamship. Then it was printed. The underlined terms we can be certain of because there are records of printing, there are records for perforation, there are records for invoicing that are all outlined in De Worm's work from 1953. I don't know if you're all familiar with the records, but just a wonderful source of information. I managed to purchase a 2-volume set of this fine book, and that provided a lot of data for this investigation. So printing and gumming, then perforating, and then packaging. And you know, from the School of Hard Knocks, Perkins and Bacon discovered that they had to package these in a waterproof system, and so it's equivalent to what we would know as a sardine tin. So they tinned these stamps before they put them on the steamships to keep them from getting wet, obviously. Invoicing, very good invoicing. Dispatch, so there was an interval many times between the time a batch of stamps was finished and the time it was actually placed on a ship. A ship was booked and a voyage was undertaken to deliver them to the islands. Normally, I think this interval was fairly short, no more than a day or two. But thinking about consignment 42, I believe, the interval there, the stamps were ready by April 28th, and the ship did not depart until May 30th. And so that's the next phase of my investigation, is to look at when stamps came into use based on when the steamer carrying those stamps arrived in the island and the stamps were distributed. So I think on average, we can presume about 8 weeks, an interval of 8 weeks from the time the request was sent until the stamps were received. So, you got to take that into account when we're looking at dates that cancellations started and what have you, and applying those to the different consignments. I'm going to call this Pitcher's New Catalog. So I've divided all of the Trinidad consignments into their invoice dates. And so we've got 2 lines for consignment 1 because there were 2 different colors of stamps. These stamps sat around for the better part of 2 years before anybody thought about using them. And in that interval, many of them became unusable. Only about 10% of this first consignment ever came to use. These numbers on the right-hand side are all numbers of sheets printed. So why the decimal places? Well, if you think about it, 454 and a half sheets would be 50,000 stamps at 110 stamps per sheet. And so depending on how the agent ordered these, you had these odd numbers of stamps consigned or sheets consigned, partial sheets. I don't know whether Perkins Bacon just rounded up or whether they actually cut a sheet in half and sent that. And what happened to the remainder? All questions that, bear on, this concept of mid stamps. The other thing I'll point out from here is if you look the first, from this point up, look at those colors: brown, brown, gray, purple, brown. There's a blue, lilac, gray, light blue. So I have a hunch that whoever was picking these colors was colorblind because they are very difficult to distinguish from one another. Not until we get down to the reds do we really have anything to work with. Um, so the perforations all the way down to the 15th consignment, they were all imperfect, and I'm showing that the paper was blued. I'm sure you're familiar, anybody who's familiar with these stamps knows about the blued paper. It was a chemical reaction between something in the paper and something in the ink that resulted in the back of the stamp particularly having a blue cast to it. We can look at that a little bit. We got two consignments, actually four consignments of pin perf stamps, and then just three consignments of really perforated stamps. The A1 being the clean cut perfs, and the A2 being the rough perfs, more properly intermediate perfs. And we'll look at those perforations. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on Trinidad stamps, but here we are. So I've tried to sort these into their various consignments. Of course, consignment 1 is off the books. It was absorbed into consignment 2. Consignment 3, Sir John says that he has no idea where the concept of consignment 3 came from, because he has no representative material. And so within these rows here, you have stamps that are fairly similar in their coloration. And in particular, note this consignment 4, right, which was invoiced in November 1852. And here is what we probably would presume to be a type 01B cancellation here. Right, I mean, Nigel's the expert on this. He could correct us if we're wrong. This looks like it might be an 01B down here. So if this cancellation device became available in August 1851, it would have been available for use in 1853, obviously. So, but on the other hand, this type 0.2 cancellation device, available January 1853. How did it get used on these earlier stamps? Do I have these misclassified, or were these stamps really not put into use until that late date? That's a really difficult question to answer at this stage, especially with this group of stamps. And I may have these all messed up in terms of my assertion of their particular consignment. Here's another page of Trinidad stamps. And I'm particularly interested in this because consignment 6 was the first appearance of the red stamps. So we could easily say that they were not printed before September 1853. And again, we see a lot of the 0.1B cancellation device used on those. Down here at the bottom, these are all of the later type 0.2 cancellation device, which fits very well. You can also see on these three stamps here, the bluing actually shows through to the front of the stamps, and that was classic for the heavily blued stamps. That's one identifying feature. This stamp on piece here, you don't even need to soak it off because you can see the bluing from the front. Here's the rest of my Trinidad grouping. I love this piece here because it allows us to specifically place this stamp probably in consignment 13, which was printed in March 1858. And of course, that cancellation reads May 30th, 1858. So probably came from that consignment 13, maybe consignment 12, but at any rate, and I'm grouping together some of these consignments because physically they're just very difficult to tell apart. Here we are down at consignment 15. This is our first appearance of the second design, the 4 pence, the 6 pence, and the 1 shilling in the beautiful indigo color. So shifting over to Barbados, similar scheme here. The first consignment was lost with the ship that was carrying them, which actually caught fire in early January 1852 off the Scilly Isles. And of course, that whole consignment was lost. And Perkins Bacon probably heard about this before the Crown Agent in the island did. And so they went ahead and printed a replacement consignment right away and shipped that in due order. So again, we're arranging these stamps in order they were printed based on their invoice dates. And, I would submit that a stamp printed in February could likely be distinct from a stamp printed in June, notwithstanding the color. And even these 1 penny blue stamps, again, that would have been 50,000 stamps in a batch. Here we are, we're almost a year apart there. And so, a lot can happen in a year with respect to how inks are mixed and what have you. So lots of opportunity to distinguish those different consignments in my mind. That's the challenge that I'm putting to myself in this project. Consignment 10 was the first one with red stamps. And then we come down to consignment 15, the first one with the second design stamps, the 6 pence and 1 shilling stamps. And here they're getting a little smarter. They're ordering stamps in terms of the number of a number. So this 500 sheets would have been 55,000 stamps, right? So that's the Crown Agent's getting a little smarter with his ordering to simplify things at Perkins Bacon. These 909.1 orders per sheets, that would have been 100,000 stamps. So did they really include 909 sheets plus 1 row or what? I mean, it's just, it's kind of, if in today's world, you just, send them 910 sheets, you wouldn't fuss with splitting hairs to that degree. But who knows what they did in practice. So here's the imperforates that I have of Barbados, first 11 consignments. I'm just going to focus on these red stamps here. They're all blued, and it brings up a point. There was never first designed red stamp imperforate that was not printed with the paper that turned blue. And that middle stamp there, you don't see much blue coloration there, but it has to be, from that same consignment, even though the bluing is quite different. And of course, you can imagine there were variable conditions which resulted in the bluing. What else to point out here for Nigel's benefit? There's a 3, there's a couple of 5s, there's a 7, there's an 11. These are all from the early cancellation, C1 cancellations, which the devices were provided to the GPO well in advance of the first stamps arriving in the island. So you can kind of make out perhaps that this stamp here resembles that second iteration, and these stamps up here, earlier stamps, resemble the first iteration. And I don't know if these iterations are ordered in time. They would seem to be by my investigation. Some of you probably know better. The piece here is very interesting to me. If you look carefully, you can see a double line maritime type cancellation right here. And you see that it's backwards, DOES, the last 4 letters of the early spelling of Barbados, DOES. And across here, you can just make out that that's 1855. It's in reverse, so it's a kind of a ghost cancellation from the letter that laid on top of it with wet ink still, wet cancel ink, which reminds me, the cancellation ink was also provided by Perkins Bacon. The last date known of this cancellation device here was October 1864, found in consignment 30. So cancellation devices had a limited lifespan. This one happened to persist longer, and we could probably imagine a scenario where in the GPO, the Bridgetown PO, where there was much heavier traffic in terms of letters passing, what have you, that these canceling devices would have worn out. The central numerals were replaceable, so you could get a hold of the St. Mary's Parish, St. Lucy's Parish, number 11, and say, hey, send us a couple of ones. Well, yeah, we're running out of ones down here in Bridgetown. So a lot of things going on there. It's said that the number one canceling device typically had 4 lines above and 3 lines below. I can't find one right offhand that's reversed, but be that as it may, these numbers could be flipped end for end, the central numeral. See that the device here has 4 lines above and 3 lines below, but there are stamps known that where that is reversed. Here are the later consignments. Here we see a C2 cancellation used on a consignment, an earlier stamp perhaps, and across the bottom, these 1 shilling stamps, that was, what did I say, consignment 15, right? And so how did that later cancellation appear on an earlier stamp is the question. And that's what kind of drove my whole project here. I think the obvious answer is that the 1 shilling stamp was oversupplied to the island, and the blank sheets or the unused sheets sat in the postal clerk's drawer for months or even years before they were used. And we see this occurring over and over, particularly with the 1 shilling stamps. They were constantly oversupplied. Again, for Nigel's benefit, here's a 3, a 4, a 5, a 10, and 2 11s. I grouped them together. And as you can tell, I'm kind of grouping consignments more in the interest of time here, and also to disguise my failings in identifying them. Watermark papers, we'll talk about that. We're kind of jumping ahead because they don't appear until much later, but it's useful to understand the limitations around printing here. These 2 papers were different sizes. When the papers were produced, there were 3 different papers used, including small star, large star, and unwatermarked. Actually, I said different. They all had the same composition. The only difference was that there was a device added to the mold to create the watermark. The mold was roughly 1 foot wide and 2 foot long, so it produced a double sheet, which was cut in half. And on these 2 sheets, I believe it's the bottom edge where it was cut in half. So the stamp images occupied a space of 8 by 10 inches on this piece of paper. And the paper itself, this is from Bacon and Napier's work again. The paper itself, the large star paper was larger. It was a little wider and an inch longer, or 2 inches longer, if you take 2 sheets into account. And so the large star paper was preferred for printing because it was much easier to cut. It took less care to cut it so that, you can see on this small star paper, particularly in this corner, that's what we call a decal edge. So a decal was produced. A decal was used to constrain the pulp to the mold in the paper making process. It was basically just like an empty picture frame that was pressed down, and that created this distorted edge here, the decal edge. So that had to be avoided when you were printing. And the large star paper gave much more capacity for avoiding that decal edge, and so thus was preferred by the printers. So here are the images of the 2 star watermarks. I think of the large watermark as occupying more than half of the stamp's width, certainly, obviously more than half of the stamp's width, whereas the small star is closer to half of the stamp's width. And that's how I tell them apart. Because of the particular orientation, the 2 points are always pointing up and down with stamps from different countries using these same papers. The watermarks are sideways, but not for Barbados. They're not sideways for Barbados printings. Here's a little sidebar on split star watermarks. You've probably heard of these. The reason I show this is to put forth a caution, particularly this stamp on the left here. If you had a paper remnant that happened to cover a corner here, you could easily miss that watermark. And so the appeal is here to make sure that all paper, envelope paper remnants are removed from the back of stamps before watermark detection is done. When they soldered the wires to the paper molds to make the watermarks, they put the points equidistant apart. And of course, that resulted in a shorter spacing for the small star watermarks. And that's what resulted in the split star watermarks. You don't see this with the large stars. But, again, if you think back to the early days of stamp collecting, let's say in the 1880s, people were not as sensitive to the integrity of the paper of the stamp. So it was very common for stamp collectors to just rip the stamp off the envelope, thereby oftentimes leaving a paper remnant on the back of the stamp. And I would say a third to half of the stamps that I purchased for this investigation had paper remnants on them. So did a lot of soaking, 100 years hence or 150 years hence. So just a sidebar on the split star watermarks. So I'm going to roll through the perfs here, and then we'll look at the Barbados stamps and call it a day. I see I've only got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to have to move. The first colonial inquiries into the possibility of obtaining perforated sheets of stamps were made in 1855-58 by Greece and Ceylon. And then the first consignments, colonial consignments requesting perforation were actually perforated in July and September 1859. They were done by a gal known as Miss Stewart. And this was a very crude and labor-intensive process. Basically, a pinwheel and a ruler, one sheet at a time, and you had to move the ruler 23 times for each sheet. Miss Stewart generated records showing that she had perforated, or her apprentices had perforated 1,800 sheets in a day. Boy, oh boy, that's a lot of work. 1,800 times 23, you're getting up close to, what would that be? That's a lot of work. It seems apparent that, particularly with Barbados, the 12.5 and 14 perps were intermingled on a particular consignment. So they probably had several different pinwheels, and they had as many people working as they had pinwheels to get this done. Here's a quote from a correspondence from Perkins Bacon. "We're ashamed at the price we have to charge to pay ourselves for doing it." So obviously they recognized how labor intensive it was. 4 consignments to Trinidad. There are the sheets, and roughly the same number of sheets perforated with the pin perforator, but only in 1 consignment to Barbados. So 910 sheets of the pale yellow green, and the same for the blue stamps, the 1 penny stamps. Miss Stewart's perforation records didn't always match up great with the printing records. So there was obviously some loss associated in the printing process, whether they screwed it up, the pinwheel got away from them and they wrecked a sheet of stamps. That was certain to have occurred. And again, how were those stamps accounted for to inland revenue? Who knows? Okay, so here are some examples of the pin perforations. This stamp here is probably most representative. You can see there's no paper whatsoever removed in the process. The bottom row might belie that assertion, or as it turns out, the top row, this is the same stamp. But nevertheless, this is a feature, a defining feature of pin perforation is that there is no paper removed in the perforating process. So just some representative looks. In the marketplace, very often rough perforations are confused and called pin perforations. Okay, so the clean cut perforation. We got the Griffiths perforator, which cost 103 pounds. By the way, I wanted to mention that Perkins Bacon charged, I believe it was 88 pounds to produce plate for printing. In today's money, I think that's about $10,000. So, that was billable to the colony, probably paid ultimately by Inland Revenue, and it really limited the colony's desire for variation in the stamp designs. If they had to get a new plate produced, they couldn't cough up that $10,000. I don't know how many pounds that is in today's money, but it's a lot of money. So, so there were a lot of compromises made. The Griffiths perforator, this clean cut perf, it deteriorated in the quality of the perfs quite rapidly. And so really only one consignment to Trinidad got through with this perforating device. So that was 12 days after the perforator was put in use. And then another, so there's only one consignment to Trinidad. Now, we could include the repaired Griffiths perforator. It was repaired sometime in January 1861, fitted new pins and repaired plate. This is a quote from the records. And the maker, Griffiths, charged £6 for that repair. So again, we'll come to, there were further repairs carried out on this device. Again, this deteriorated pretty rapidly, but we did manage to get a couple of consignments perforated to Barbados in January of 1861. So the same month. These are the only three consignments that we could call clean cut perfs. So here's the device. It works like a guillotine. So this goes up and down, and the sheet, it can only perforate one sheet of stamps at a time. And to perforate a line, so you had to move the sheet 23 times to perforate it, and you used the fence. So you butted the sheet up against the fence, moved the fence, and so you could go through in your mind all of the different workflows that might have been used to get, let's say a 1,000 sheet of stamps printed on this device. And so it explains, as we get into the intermediate perfs, it explains why you see differences on a single stamp. Anyway, it also has implications for how carefully that sheet of stamps was cut before you started laying it against the fence, right? You wanted that cut to be absolutely parallel to the stamps. So it probably required a cutting procedure to prepare the sheets for perforation. Here are the clean cut perfs of record. And so these are fairly easy to identify. Again, just absolutely perfect perfs on all four sides. Here I got a couple of hanging chads on that one. And there's another one somewhere. That might be the only one. So yeah, maybe a little gray area on that. But so we could certainly group stamps in this consignment or these consignments by the character of the perfs. Jonathan was hinting at a color difference here to indicate maybe to sort these into consignment 20 or 21. I haven't explored that. We'll have to explore that further at some point. Okay, so here's the Barbados consignments, the perforated consignments, start with the pin at the top. We've got these two consignments that were considered clean cut perf repaired. So only green and blue stamps. And then we're moving into the rough cut perfs, the A2s. So we've got some some six-penny, half-shilling stamp, half-shilling stamps, six-penny stamps, some four-penny stamps, and some one-penny stamps from the first design here. So these would be only 3 consignments of the rough cut perfs, the true rough cut. And then we have a whole long list of intermediate perfs before we get down to the final repaired ones. So let's see, 1 consignment of orange red in the rough and 1 consignment of the red in the rough. So here we are. This is just a documentation. Discs of paper remain in the holes. That's the cardinal signal of the rough perfs. And here are a couple of my best examples, particularly the Barbados stamp, that left right-hand side there. You can see there's a disc of paper in every single hole, as well as across the bottom of that stamp. So these are clearly rough cut perfs. The 6-pence Barbados, that could only come from 1 consignment, and the Trinidad 4-pence first design, again, only 1 consignment had perfs of this nature. Okay, so now we come to the intermediate perfs. These would be called the A2 intermediate. Commencing in August of 1862 with consignment 25 in Barbados. And the way this was done is Miss Stewart would occasionally pass a piece of greased paper through the Griffiths perforator to ostensibly lubricate the pins. Grease was transferred from the paper to the perforator, and at the same time, the grease adhered to discs, the paper discs, and pulled them out of the holes, which restored functionality. The pins were probably lubricated by this grease, and I wonder if it produced a greasy residue in some perfs. The intermediate perfs, the records show that productivity leveled out by this technique of lubricating the machine before use, and it must have continued all the way through until the perforator was once again rebuilt. So lots and lots of sheets, almost 18,000 sheets perforated this way for Barbados. So this is going to be, of the perforated stamps, this is going to be the most common perforation that you're going to see. And so here they are, intermediate perfs. You see discs of paper in the holes on one side. You see clean cut perfs on the other side. And, something, I picked these 4 stamps out because that dark coloration along the edge kind of hints at perhaps a grease residue left over from the use of the greased paper. So why did the perfs vary from one edge to the other with the intermediate perfs? I have to believe this had to do with the workflow. I find it useful to put myself in the shoes of the people doing the work. They'd grab 1 sheet of stamps, they'd perforate 1 line, and what was their next step? Would they move the gauge to perforate the next row? No, they'd probably perforate the whole stack before they moved the gauge. And then they'd move the gauge and perforate the next row. So, a given stamp, there might have been a huge interval between the time one edge was perfed and the other edge was perfed. And this explains the variation from side to side on a single stamp. Okay, anything else here? There's a number 7 boot heel for Nigel. There's a number 11, obviously. Okay, so moving to the final, well, not the final, but the next to last perforation, the A3. So we had major repairs to the Griffiths perforator. This time costed $30, 30 pounds. And that included new plates, pins, bolts, and guide. And these new pins were different. They weren't flat-faced, they were pointed. The gauge was now a solid 15, unerring 15, and used only for these 2 consignments, and they're all on watermark paper. So those features make these fairly easy to identify. However, we shall see that there's still places to get tricked. So these are my A3 perfs. This is made with the repaired Griffiths perforator. The notable thing here is you see a wide variety of cancellations here. I'm going to run out of time to cover the cancellations in great detail, but look at this row of 1 shilling stamps. Over here, we've got the separate CDS and boot heel cancellation, which was a very late cancellation, probably from 1870. Well, this one is dated 1875. You can just make it out. That's an 1875 cancellation on a stamp that was printed in 1872. So more evidence that these stamps laid around in the clerk's drawers for long periods of time. In the interest of time, I could spend a lot more time here. I'm going to just keep moving. The B perfs made with the Francis machine. This was a smaller but not very robust machine, producing very rough 11.5 to 12.5 perforations, and it was used in consignment 42 only, the halfpenny and 4-penny only, which were all on small star watermark paper, and it was useful for horizontal perfs only. So we ended up with a compound perf. The throat on this machine was only 12 inches wide, so it couldn't handle the lengthwise the length on the sheets. It could only handle the width. So you have these 2 different stamps that were compound perforated. So that's useful to us because we know with certainty that those vertical perfs were 15, were done with the late perforating device. We know with certainty, right? So we could use that stamp as a gauge. And I'll come to that real quick here. Finally, the Somerset House comb perforating device was used only for the last consignment printed by Perkins Bacon, and it was subsequently used on all the Delarue printings off of the same plates. This machine was owned by Inland Revenue. They owned the patent on it, and for some reason, they would not let Perkins Bacon use this very fine perforating device. So I'm showing with the dashed lines here, I'm trying to show that it perforated 3 sides of the stamp at once. I think it could perforate a row of 24 stamps. So it was useful for many different printings. And I presume that these vertical perfs were adjustable widthwise. But it was produced very fine perforations. And I'm not going to show you any. Well, the stamps that I've copied into the spaces are all from that halfpenny. You can see it's from the second design, printed in 1873 by Perkins. And these were subsequently canceled in August of 1874. So here we are. We're going to do a little experiment here. I've got 2 blue stamps here. How are they perfed? They both have the small watermark. You can make some presumptions based on their appearance. There's some pieces of paper in the holes here. This one's pretty clear. But what we'll do is we'll drop a compound perf in the middle because we know that these are perf 15 on that orange stamp because it's a compound perf. So now it becomes quite obvious that the stamp on the right is perf 15. The stamp on the left is not, right? It's quite obvious. It's much more useful than a perforation gauge in my mind. All 3 stamps have the small star watermark. So here they are, A2 and A3 perfs, and we can identify the consignment quite easily from the perforations in that manner. Okay. All right, so I'm 5 minutes over time, Jonathan, and I haven't gotten to the circular date stamps yet.
Well, Paul, I think we can give you another 5 minutes or so if you want to just carry on and finish this off. That would be very useful.
Okay, yeah, we'll do that. So we've got 2 circular date stamps that came into use for the Seated Britannias. First is the E2. There's an error in this reproduction. The digits are shown here. They're in a straight line. They're not arranged in a circular line. And then here, the distinguishing features of the A7. Again, this was a recycled packet post device. which had been retired in 1845 and was brought back into use because of the shortage of canceling devices that were in good shape. And a distinguishing feature here is the full year date shown and the E in Barbados, along with the double line. So here's a double line cancellation. There's a P right there. So that's either September or April 29th, 1874. So that's the last date known that I have for this consignment 43. I do have a stamp from 1882, obviously produced by Delarue, that still uses this maritime, this recycled packet post device. Here's the broken one variety. I'm showing two different stages, possibly from the same device. So you see a crack across the one here. The top part of the one still remains. On this particular stamp, it looks like the top part of that one has disappeared. This is on a stamp. I guess you'd have to presume that was trimmed perfs. You can maybe see it down in the lower corner here. I'm not sure. But just another, this is consignment 38, December 16th, 1868 was when it was invoiced. Here's print date versus cancellation. This is really the meat and potatoes. So I've got consignment 42 stretching from November 14th, 1872 to May 19th, 1873. And actually, this one should also be up on this June 6th, should also be up here for consignment 42. Because again, this consignment didn't arrive until sometime in June, probably beyond June 20th. So we've got some work to do again, the colors don't help you very much in deciding which consignment this stamp comes from, this June 6th cancellation. But here again, you see the double line cancellation appearing at kind of random places. I'd like to show this. I got one more slide after this one. I like to show the red stamps. These are all 4-pence stamps arranged in order of printing. And when you put a bunch of stamps together like this, you can easily compare the rows and see, hey, those are different colors. By gosh, that's a dull brown red, and by gosh, that's a lake rose. These colors come from the work that Bacon and Napier did in 1896 to do a better job of describing these colors. From Perkins Bacon perspective, these stamps are all red. Okay, they didn't distinguish between orange, vermilion, what have you. Here's dull vermilion down here. But when you arrange a bunch of stamps row by row this way, the colors pop for you. So it's easy. That's an identifying feature that's easy to use. You can also see how the cancellations evolve with time here. You see the boot heel coming in, the boot heel persisting to 1870, and so on. So I really like this slide. This was my trick for sorting the Danish bicolors, DWI bicolors, into printings, is you get a bunch of them lined up and you can easily distinguish colors. Here is the 6-pence doing the same thing. So bright orange vermilion pops pretty good. Dull orange vermilion, not so much. Turns out that I believe it was the dull. No, it was this orange. This consignment 40 was quite subject to oxidation, and so there's another clue that helps you sort these into consignments. There's a stamp that's heavily oxidized, and we know that the stamps from consignment 40 were all heavily oxidized, just from experience, just from getting a bunch of stamps and trying to sort them. Here's some boot heel cancellation devices way up here in 1861. Again, these stamps sat around in the clerk's drawer for way too long. So you can also make out some interesting features on the A1 canceling devices, or the C1, sorry, the early ones. And I should have pointed that out earlier, but you see some degradation in the quality of the cancellation. It looks like these lines are out of alignment with each other. Probably the same device, I would submit, might even been the same clerk that canceled those two stamps. But obviously, this device here, these two stamps, is different than the device above because of the alignment of these lines. So lots of clues in there. And really, that's all I have. Here's my sources. Perkins Bacon Records was very useful. Again, here's Sir John Marriott's work, Trinidad. He was the one that turned me on to the concept of consignments, and a couple of the Stanley Gibbons handbooks at the top. Here's the one I'm looking for. So I'm in the market. I'll pay $100 for that book. Who's got it? Who needs to sell it? Because I want to look at the arrivals of the Royal Maid steam packets, arrival times in Bridgetown and Port of Spain, so we can do a better job of sorting these stamps into their consignments. And that's all I had, Jonathan. Thanks for your time and attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. I saw David Druitt fabulously writing down, scribbling down the name of that book. So I'm sure he's the person to talk to about that. I know I've learned some stuff from that, which I wasn't expecting, I have to say. And I think there's a couple of bits in there that might change the book that Paul and I just recently authored in terms of some of the dates of some of these stamps. So that's wonderful. I think if we can open this up for questions for now, that would be tremendous. So does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask Paul about anything that you've seen so far?
I have a couple. Well, first of all, questions and observations, and
Go ahead,
probably more for
Nigel.
discussion. All right. Well, first of all, Paul, hopefully you guys can. I don't know if my video is on, but if it's not, at least you can hear
Yeah, I
me.
can see you fine. You're in your car. I can tell.
Yes, it's still relatively early here in Chicagoland. But first of all,
Yeah.
I really appreciated your investigation into, the printing and helping explain how the printing process was done. I mean, I've read a lot about printing, but I kind of visualize it a little bit more now with the diagrams that you had. So that was very helpful. I really like the attempt to try and categorize printings and consignments and shipping and stuff. So thanks for that. I did have a couple comments that I noted to myself. As far as I am aware, and I'm sure David Druitt would have some more info to share on this, I don't believe the paper for imperforate stamps was ever watermarked for Trinidad. I think you had it listed as small star and large star. But my understanding is watermarks only became on the paper when they were perforated onwards. I don't
Yes,
think.
that's what I have too. Only for
Okay.
Barbados consignments 40 through 44. Yes, you're
Okay.
correct. None of the imperforate stamps had watermark paper. It was the
Okay.
same paper. It was all produced by Rush Hill in Northampton. It was all the same composition. It's just that the molds were changed at some point to put the wires on them to create the watermarks.
Okay, because I think what threw me off was when you had the large sheets of Trinidad up and was referencing small star and large star. So that threw me off.
Yeah,
I kind of
okay. Yeah,
correlate.
so I use that diagram simply to show that there were two different papers. I don't know what I'm doing here. I've stopped. Okay. There were two different papers. I can scroll back up there if we want.
No.
There we are.
I understand what you were trying to explain on the paper. I just wanted to make the comments about watermarks on the Trinidad paper.
So, do you think that these two sheets, are these your sheets?
I wish they were. They are not.
Okay. They So I'm presuming that they're watermarked, and you say that you don't think they're watermarked.
That is exactly what I'm saying. And David would probably be able to chime in too. I don't think these imperforated sheets of paper for Trinidad were ever watermarked.
Okay. My counter to that would be just because they're unperforated does not mean that they were printed with that intent. It could. I mean, again, most mint stamps are remainders that never made it to the islands to be used for postage. So God knows what printing they came from.
Yeah, and that's something for more investigation. And I don't
Sure.
have sheets, so I can't really examine them in detail. And then the second comment I wanted to make regarding Perkins Bacon losing the contract, it was my understanding that the reason they lost the contract was because they had given away stamps as on a request from Sir Rowland Hill's nephew to solicit stamps, and then the stamps that they gave away were canceled, and then the crown agent was they were frowning on that for security lapses in judgment, and hence they penalized them by taking away the contract. And I'm sure David and others will be able to chime in, but there was a book written by Peter Half that explains why why Perkins Bacon lost that contract, and it had to do with the fact that they had given away stamps, which was considered property of the state, and they should not have done
Sure.
that.
Yeah. Well, I agree fully with that bottom line. Sir Rowland Hill organized the London Philatelic Exhibition, and Edward Bacon and Napier, in their book Barbados, described the Great Find, which was somewhere around 1891. And we're probably talking about the same incident where Sir Rowland Hill got his hands on all these remainders and proceeded to distribute them to his friends and neighbors and buddies in the collecting community. And you have to bet that Inland Revenue did not look on that with affection. They were probably somewhat pissed off about that. But that was 1891. That was after.
So the incident I'm referring to way before that. This was the reason that De La Rue got the contract. They took it away and gave it to De La Rue. So this was like in the 1860s, I believe, is when this incident happened.
Well, 1861 was the last stamps that were printed by Perkins Bacon for Trinidad. And so,
Correct.
that makes sense. And, Rowland Hill may have had his appetite whetted early on and then proceeded to continue to, get his grubby mitts on these remainders and do with them what he would. But the point that I make, I think we're in substance, we're in agreement. The details are left to the mists of time, I'm sure. But the point I was trying to make is that Bacon and Napier also recognized this as a source of stamps for collectors. And so I really will not buy mint stamps because they're not at all representative of actual postage for the most part, because they're remainders. Printer's waste, perforation, ink smears. There had to be a lot of wastage in this process. It was all done by hand, right? And where did that waste end up? It had, a smart manager would have accounted for that to Inland Revenue to keep his butt out of the ringer. But apparently Perkins Bacon were rather lax about that.
Fair enough. All right, I've said my piece.
2 cents.
Paul.
Thanks, Nigel. Good to see you.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Paul, you make a lot of references to the Inland Revenue. You say that the paper came from
Rush Hill.
Rush Hill. Was that paper?
Rush Hill was a subsidiary of Perkins Bacon, by understanding.
Right. Was that paper special? In that it was not available anywhere else, like sort of,
Well, it could very well be. It was certainly of a very highly prescribed composition. it seemed to be rather consistent across time, except for thickness. And there's an interesting anecdote about thickness in that the way they were paid was by weight. And so there was a spec for a ream, 500 sheets, weighing a certain amount. And so to make a ream weigh up, they would mix thick sheets in with thin sheets, so to speak, or vice versa, so that the ream came in at spec. So there probably wasn't a lot of quality control over thickness. And I guess I would pretty much discount any commercial catalog's reference to paper thickness as a distinguishing feature.
With banknotes, the paper used was unique, wasn't it? It couldn't be bought.
Right. It had some rag content and stuff like that.
But I didn't know that, not sure that that applied to paper used for printing postage stamps. If that's the
I would think not.
Right, well, in that case, then, you couldn't link the amount of paper purchased with the quantity of stamps issued and say, well, there's a
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that.
So I don't think Inland Revenue could have any interest in the subject. Well,
except that once the paper is printed, right, it had a value printed on it. So it was ostensibly usable for postage. I mean, no one would know the difference if you hijacked a remainder and used it to mail your letters.
Oh, yes, I agree with that. But I think that they could only actually use the stamps in Barbados or Trinidad. So, and the paper is, the printer's in London. So you have to get the stamps in a clandestine manner from London out to the colonies. And there's no, as far as I know, there's no suggestion that ever happened.
Well, I think you have a good point. I mean, I wouldn't want to second guess Inland Revenue's objectives or motivations. Realize, of course, that Perkins Bacon was printing for many, many different colonial entities simultaneously, 20 or 30, I would guess. And so there must have been massive amounts of remainder material just laying about. And, if I was an auditor for Inland Revenue, that would kind of get under my skin.
Yeah. The Perkins Bacon, if you read Marriott's book on Trinidad on page, I think it's, I've lost the page now.
I have to confess, I haven't
on page
read that
49 of Marriott's book, he states quite clearly that they lost the contract due to the Rowland Hill reprints. And that was in 1861, and that was specifically these stamps which were had cancelled postmarks put on them, which Peter Jaffe wrote about. But Marriott does make the point that was the catalyst for getting rid of Perkins Bacon and giving the contract to De La Rue. And he says there was friction. So I think you're probably correct that it was poor accounting that was also a bigger issue for them, but which they couldn't actually prove.
Yes, and I'll just say to that, the controversy continues. Yeah, very good point. Thank you, David.
So, any other questions?
Yeah, Paul. This is Jerry Wyrick. On the chart or on the page, you had a block of 9 that I took it to mean that this one here, that there was a transfer block of 9 stamps that was used to fill out a full sheet. Is that correct?
No, I'm presuming this is just a portion of a full sheet. And the only reason I selected this is because it's got 4 intersections on it. And that's what I magnified there to show just how poorly aligned the rows and columns were. Just as a normal, I mean, this is obviously from a plate, right? So every single sheet would have had the same poor alignment on it. And that was really what made perforation difficult of this particular type of stamp. I mean, it's very unusual to find a stamp that has the perfs clear of the design on all 4 sides. Well-centered stamps are not common with this issue.
Right. Okay.
That was the only point I was trying to make.
Okay. I misunderstood what you were saying. I thought you were talking about this being a transfer block such that there are like maybe 9 distinct varieties from a plating perspective that you could get across a sheet. So,
as far as I know, all of the transfers were made with this roller. And I'm guessing there would have been 11 stamp impressions around this roller. So using using trigonometry, you'd say that roller was roughly 3.5 inches in diameter, right? The way the stamps are arrayed on the plate. And so when they put that roller in the press, then it would make 1 revolution to go the length of the annealed plate. And they would run that roller back and forth as many times as it took to fully manifest the impression. Then they would move the plate to the next column, and they would run the roller up and down until that column was finished, and so on. So they had to be very careful that they started the roller in the same exact place for each column that was impressed. Does that make sense?
Yep. And that serves me right for not being on time, and I missed the first slides of your presentation. Since you already went over that.
Well, we'll wait for it to drop on YouTube. But sounds like you're in Chicago, Jerry. Give me a call.
Fairfax, Virginia. So
okay. Well, we're in the same time zone at least.
Yeah.
And the good news is we're recording all this, so Jerry, you can go back and watch the beginning once we've put it up on YouTube.
There we go.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'm really curious about the workflow. Again, when I do something like this, I want to put myself in the shoes of the workers and understand the challenges they faced and how that impacted the final product. And again, I come back to this guy here. Where's my pointer? This guy right here, obviously wiping a plate, right? That had to be a very imprecise process, right? And furthermore, the records prescribed that the worker then, following the rag, burnished that inked plate with the heel of his hand. God, he must have been filthy at the end of the day. After printing a couple thousand sheets. Oh my God, it's just the amount of manual labor is just mind-boggling. We can't appreciate it in today's world.
Probably had a premature death too from some type of poisoning.
Oh, that reminds me. I was going to tell the story. When I was a kid growing up in my hometown, this would have been in the early 60s. There was a guy in town who was recognized as just being, partially insane. And we knew that he was a printer, and the rumor was always that he had drunk a bottle of ink. But yeah, sure, heavy metal poisoning, mercurials, God knows what was in these inks. And that kind of, skin contact there must have been lethal in the long run. And I think I knew someone who was so affected.
Well, just if it helps at all, Paul, there is a phrase, certainly over here in England, that somebody's as mad as a hatter. And
sure, yeah, we have that here.
From the hat making industry, of which there was a large factory in Stockport, not far from where we are. And when they made the hats, the chemicals they used included mercury. And it did drive them mad. So yes, you're absolutely right. The inks did contain all kinds of stuff, as did dyes, which actually did affect people. I'm conscious of time, everyone. Are there any other questions that anyone wants to ask of Paul while we've got him here?
Only one question I have. You mentioned when you were talking about plates the word harden about 4 times, I assume we're talking about heat. That's just what we're heating him up.
Yeah, so there's three things. There's anneal and harden, anneal, harden, anneal, harden. So to anneal a piece of steel, you would heat it up in an oven and then just shut the oven off and leave it in there until it cooled. And because the oven was closed, right, it was airtight, there was no way for carbon to get into that environment. And so during the cooling process, the steel could not absorb carbon. And that's what made it soft. Now, when you went to harden it, you would heat it up again, and then you would quench it in a bucket of oil. You would like drench it in carbon, right? And that putting that carbon into the steel hardened it. Okay. And the word is from what I've read is annealed steel was like working a piece of hard wax. I mean, it was very soft, and the engravers were very expert at piling up surplus steel where they needed to create things like blank labels. With the tooling, they could move the steel around quite readily, laterally. So the metallurgy is what makes all of this possible. And Jacob Perkins himself was an expert metallurgist. There's no doubt about it. It doesn't really imply that here. Well, it's implied, it's not stated, but it's implied with his work that he was an expert metallurgist as well as an engraver. So that's how we got where we are today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Any more questions, guys? Okay, thank you. So I think it's time for a few closing notes on this one. David, did you have any closing notes you wanted to give at this point?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Paul.
Thank you.
I
hope to get this all in writing at some point. I mean, it's just a massive. I've probably got 300 hours in this investigation so far.
But you're sort of you're like a very old school philatelist, because you study the printing process, and that's largely just gone out of the.
Yeah, I'm not a space filler. I am not a space filler as a philatelist.
But now it's all about postal history and postal rates, and that's what serious philatelists do. But the old school philatelists from the 1920s and 30s, they studied stamps and how they were made, and it's knowledge that is disappearing, sadly.
Yeah, well, and it's fascinating. These were some of the earliest stamps ever produced, and so it bears examination, that's for sure.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And finally, just to echo that, Paul, it's been fascinating. As you can probably tell, I've got 1 or 2 Britannias behind me in these shelves. And
I'm envious.
And Paul Farrimond and I, when we worked on the book recently, had a huge headache with the section on the fourpenny reds, some of which you've just managed to echo in the work that you've done. But there may still be some stuff that you've got that we didn't have in the book.
Well, let's continue the conversation.
I think Definitely. That's absolutely required. So thank you once again on behalf of the entire West Indies Philatelic Study Group. And thanks for your presentation, and we wish you all the very best.
Well, thank you for providing me with a forum. I'm really happy that this will become distributed widely.
Wonderful. Right. Thanks, everybody. Cheers for now.
All right. Bye, all. Bye. Thanks very much.